Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Zwan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep the episode short enough that you can listen to them whenever you've got a few minutes to spare in your calendar. Before I start, I would like to, as always, ask that if you like the podcast, please consider sending the link to other persons who you think would also enjoy the podcast. It would help me a lot to grow the listener base through basically word of mouth in this way. Then, this is our last podcast for today or for the year. I'm going to take a break from podcasting for December and we'll resume in the middle of January. So our topic for the last podcast episode comes from there were two bills that were published by the National Treasury on the 12th of November, the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill and the Tax Administration Laws Amendment Bill. Now, these bills are open for final comments until the 27th of November. Normally, they could still in principle be changes. Normally, there are not that many changes from these bills to the Amendment Acts, but nothing is impossible. So the topic that's included in the Tax Administration Laws Amendment Bill that I'm going to be speaking about today relates to understatement penalties, or USPs as they are also known. Now, I think, as I also mentioned last week, it makes sense if we look at these amendments to first look at what does the law currently say, then look at what will it say, and from there on you can start to apply your mind as to what the effect of that could be. So the current rule basically says if you have an understatement, so there's a definition for what is an understatement. It's a list of things that causes prejudice to the fiscus. Then SARS must impose an understatement penalty, but there is an exception to say that if the understatement is as a result of a bona fide inadvertent error, then SARS cannot impose an understatement penalty. So the concept of a bona fide inadvertent error was considered in a few court cases in the last year or two. I think most importantly the Coronation case and the Thistle case, and those of you who listen to the podcast regularly would know that in some of the earlier episodes I've spoken about these cases. Now, basically, what the courts at different levels said, so that the courts didn't consider the concept of a bona fide inadvertent error in all the different courts where the cases were held. But some of the courts essentially said that if you've taken advice, even if the advice it turns out that SARS doesn't agree with your advice, then the fact that you've taken a position that SARS doesn't agree with, it could be a bona fide inadvertent error. SARS, on the other hand, in the penalty guide, take a much more narrow interpretation of what a bona fide inadvertent error is. So the whole concept of a bona fide inadvertent error and what it should and shouldn't be has become quite contentious over the last year or two. So there are two amendments that I think are probably aimed at resolving the contentiousness and any uncertainty that may exist. So the first amendment is to say that if there is an understatement, so in other words, you've got something that falls into this list of things that would constitute an understatement, SARS must impose an understatement penalty if this understatement results from a behavior listed in the penalty table in Section 2231 of the Tax Administration Act. So I think it makes it quite clear that there's only supposed to be a penalty if the taxpayer is guilty of one of the behaviors listed in the penalty table. So that's the first point, the first amendment. The second amendment then takes the bona fide inadvertent error exception out of where it currently sits. So it's not that all the behaviors, so essentially if one analyzes the law at this point, we can probably say that irrespective of the behavior that you are guilty of, if your your understatement resulted from a bona fide inadvertent error, then SARS cannot impose an understatement penalty. So it's a sort of an overriding consideration that applies. I do, however, think especially if you look at the judgments of the courts where they discussed the other behaviors, I do, however, think that these behaviors, to say that the bona fide inadvertent error can override any of these behaviors is probably a bit too simplistic. I think there's an interplay between these behaviors. To say that if you've taken advice, then it may be that you've got reasonable grounds for the position that you've taken. It may be that you've taken reasonable care, but it's not to say that irrespective of what you've done, a bona fide inadvertent error can save you, because I think these concepts are interrelated or at least related to some extent. Be that as it may, what the rule now will now say going forward is that you need to go through or you need to consider the behaviors in the penalty table. If you are guilty of any of them, then based on the First Amendment, SARS can impose an understatement penalty. The last one is a behavior that's a bit different from the other ones. It's a behavior based on the quantum of the tax effect of your understatement, not on something that you've necessarily done wrong. So that's the substantial understatement behavior. And what the Second Amendment does is to move the bona fide inadvertent error exception to say that if you've gone through all the behaviors and that's the only one, that's the one that you fall in. So in other words, you're not guilty of any of the other behaviors, but the understatement is substantial. If that understatement then results from a bona fide inadvertent error, SARS must still remit the understatement penalty. So to summarize, I think the few things to take home and think about during the holiday. Firstly, it's to take note that there are changes to the understatement penalty regime, but then more importantly, to think as to how the changes in the structure of the rules would affect your own approach when dealing with disputes about understatement penalties that's part of those disputes. So you can't at the onset necessarily go and argue a bona fide inadvertent error and therefore the penalty should be remitted. The approach changes a bit. So I think that's probably the most important thing to take forward, is that you need to adjust your approach to dealing with disputes on USPs. That's that for today's episode. If you've got any questions, comments, please let me know. My email address is in the show notes as always. And just a reminder that nothing in the podcast is intended to be tax advice. Until next time, I hope that you've got a blessed festive season, and I'm looking forward to have all of you listening to the podcast again in 2026. Enjoy your holidays. Goodbye.